4 philosophical traditions and the unlocatable subject, from failure to convergence. 4.1 Philosophy's distinctive approach and its shared limitation. Philosophy approaches the question of the subject of experience from the inside rather than the outside, where neuroscience examines the brain as an object of third-person investigation. Philosophy examines experience itself through conceptual analysis, logical argument, and introspective reflection. This different starting point gives philosophy access to dimensions of the problem that neuroscience cannot reach. Philosophy can articulate what it is like to be a subject, can analyze the logical structure of first-person experience, and can identify the conceptual requirements that any adequate account of the subject must satisfy. Yet despite these advantages, philosophy has arrived at the same fundamental impasse as neuroscience. The subject of experience resists every philosophical attempt to locate, define, or explain it with the same consistency and the same structural necessity that it resists every neuroscientific attempt. This section documents that failure across the history of philosophical engagement with the problem, demonstrates its structural character, and draws out its implications for the direction of inquiry that chapters 2 and 3 will pursue. The shared limitation between neuroscience and philosophy is worth stating precisely at the outset, because it will guide the analysis throughout this section. Both disciplines attempt to make the subject of experience into an object of investigation. Neuroscience does this by treating the brain as the object within which the subject is presumed to reside. Philosophy does this by treating concepts, arguments, and introspective reports as the objects through which the subject is presumed to be revealed. In both cases, the method requires turning the subject into something that can be examined, described, and explained. But the subject is precisely what cannot be turned into an object without ceasing to be the subject. Every attempt to examine the subject uses the subject to conduct the examination, leaving the subject itself perpetually one step beyond the reach of the method. This categorical feature of the subject-object relationship is the structural limitation that unites the failure of neuroscience and the failure of philosophy, and it is the feature that points beyond both disciplines toward the ontological account that the present book proposes. 4.2 Descartes and the localization error. The most famous attempted solution to the problem of the subject in the Western philosophical tradition is Descartes' proposal that the seat of the soul, and by extension the subject of experience, is located in the pineal gland, the only unpaired structure in the brain. Descartes arrived at this proposal through his famous method of radical doubt. By doubting everything that could be doubted, he arrived at the one thing that could not be doubted, the fact of his own thinking and therefore his own existence as a thinking subject. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. This is perhaps the most celebrated moment in the history of philosophy, and it correctly identifies something of fundamental importance. The subject of experience is immediately and indubitably given to itself in a way that no object of experience is. The subject cannot doubt its own existence because the act of doubting is itself an act of the subject, confirming the subject's existence in the very moment of attempting to deny it. Yet Descartes immediately made an error that has haunted philosophy ever since. Having correctly identified the subject as something fundamentally different from any object, he then tried to locate it within an object, the pineal gland, as though it were a physical thing residing at a specific anatomical address. This was abandoned almost immediately upon anatomical scrutiny. The pineal gland turned out to be a structure involved in the regulation of circadian rhythms, with no special properties that could account for its proposed role as the seat of the soul. But the deeper error was not the specific choice of the pineal gland. It was the assumption that the subject of experience must be locatable somewhere within the physical system of the body and brain. This assumption, which Descartes shared with the neuroscientific program that came after him, is precisely what the present book's argument against both traditions challenges. The subject is not locatable within any physical system because the subject is not a physical thing. It is the ground within which physical things arise as objects of experience. 4.3 Hume and the dissolution of the subject. Hume, 1739, approached the problem from within, beginning not with external observation of the brain, but with introspective examination of his own experience. His conclusion was devastating for any theory that posits a substantial self as the subject of experience. Upon introspecting carefully in search of a self that underlies and unifies his experiences, Hume found only a succession of perceptions, impressions, and ideas, but no persisting subject underlying them. He could never catch himself without a perception and could never observe anything but the perception itself. From this, he concluded that the self is not a substance, but a bundle of perceptions, a collection of experiences with no experiencer behind them. Hume's bundle theory is philosophically honest in a way that many subsequent theories have not been. It takes the introspective evidence seriously and follows it to its logical conclusion without imposing a theoretical subject that the evidence does not support. Yet it faces an insurmountable difficulty. A bundle of perceptions is still experienced as a bundle. The unity of the bundle, the fact that these perceptions are experienced as connected, as belonging together, as constituting a single experiential field rather than a disconnected series of unrelated events, requires explanation. If there is no subject behind the bundle, what accounts for the unity of the bundle? Hume's theory dissolves the subject, but cannot account for the undeniable fact of unified experience. It eliminates the explanandum rather than explaining it, in exactly the same way that Dennett's later eliminativism does. The bundle requires a bundler, and the bundler is precisely the subject that Hume's introspection failed to find. The failure to find the subject through introspection does not prove the subject does not exist. It proves that the subject cannot find itself through the introspective examination of its own contents, which is precisely what the structural analysis of the subject-object relationship predicts. 4.4 Kant and the transcendental subject. Kant, 1781, proposed the most sophisticated pre-20th century account of the subject of experience in his Critique of Pure Reason. Recognizing that the subject cannot be found among the contents of experience, Kant proposed that it must be sought as the condition of experience rather than as one of its contents. The transcendental unity of apperception, the I think, that must be capable of accompanying all my representations, is not an object of experience, but the formal condition that makes experience possible. It is the unity that binds all representations into a single experiential field, not by being one representation among others, but by being the logical form of their unity. This was a significant advance. Kant correctly recognized that the subject of experience cannot be found among the objects of experience, and proposed a formal account of its role as the condition of the possibility of experience. Yet Kant's transcendental subject remains a formal postulate rather than an identified reality. His framework explicitly excludes the possibility of knowing what this subject is in itself, as a thing in itself, rather than as a formal condition of appearances. Kant tells us that the subject is the condition of experience, but cannot tell us what it is, where it comes from, or how it relates to the rest of reality beyond its formal role as the unifying condition of representation. The transcendental subject is a placeholder for the answer rather than the answer itself. It names the location of the subject without identifying the subject. It is a precisely drawn, empty box. 4.5 Ibn Sina and the Floating Man. Ibn Sina, known in the Western tradition as Avicenna, developed in the 11th century a thought experiment of extraordinary logical precision that directly anticipates and, in certain respects, surpasses both Descartes' cogito and Kant's transcendental analysis in its treatment of the subject of experience. Ibn Sina's floating man argument, presented in his major philosophical works, including the Book of Salvation and the Book of Healing, invites the reader to imagine a person created fully formed and mature, but floating in air, deprived of all sensory contact with the external world, with limbs spread so as not to touch each other, with no visual, auditory, tactile, olfactory, or gustatory input of any kind. Ibn Sina asks, would such a person be aware of their own existence? His answer is unambiguous, yes. Despite the complete absence of all bodily sensations and all sensory contact with the external world, the floating person would still be aware of their own existence as a subject of experience. They would know that they exist, that something is present, that awareness is occurring, even in the total absence of any object of that awareness. The philosophical significance of this thought experiment for the question of the subject of experience is precise and far-reaching. Ibn Sina's argument establishes three specific conclusions that directly bear on the present inquiry. First, the subject of experience is not identical with the body. Since the floating person has no awareness of their body whatsoever, yet is still aware of their own existence as a subject, the subject cannot be the body or any part of it. Second, the subject of experience is not identical with any sensory or perceptual content. Since the floating person has no sensory or perceptual content of any kind, yet is still aware of their own existence, the subject cannot be constituted by or identified with any of the contents of experience. Third, the subject of experience is a non-spatial, non-material reality that exists independently of any physical reference point. It is present and self-aware in the complete absence of all physical input. These three conclusions converge precisely with the analysis of the preceding subsections, but arrive through a completely different route. Where Descartes established the indubitability of the thinking subject through the method of radical doubt, Ibn Sina establishes the non-bodily, non-sensory character of the subject through the method of systematic sensory deprivation. Where Kant established that the subject cannot be found among the objects of experience, Ibn Sina establishes that the subject persists in the complete absence of all objects of experience. The convergence of these independent lines of analysis around the same structural finding, that the subject of experience is irreducible to any physical, bodily, or sensory reference, is itself significant evidence of the universal character of this conclusion. Ibn Sina's analysis goes further than Descartes' cogito in one important respect. Descartes establishes that the thinking subject exists and is distinct from the body, but his subsequent attempt to locate the soul in the pineal gland reinstates the very assumption his cogito had undermined. Ibn Sina does not make this error. Having established that the subject exists independently of all bodily reference, he does not then attempt to locate it within the body. He identifies the subject, which he calls the human soul or nafs in the Arabic tradition, as a non-material substance whose existence is self-evident to itself, but whose nature cannot be determined through any examination of physical systems. The floating man argument also converges with the Kantian analysis in a specific way while going beyond it. Like Kant, Ibn Sina recognizes that the subject of experience cannot be found among the objects of experience. But where Kant leaves the subject as a formal condition without ontological content, a precisely drawn empty box in the formulation of the present book, Ibn Sina takes the further step of characterizing the subject positively as a self-subsisting, non-material reality whose existence is directly and immediately known to itself. This positive characterization, while remaining within the limits of rational philosophical analysis rather than appealing to revelation, points in the direction of the ontological account that the present book develops through the framework of Wadat al-Khail. 4.6. The Indian philosophical tradition, Advaita Vedanta and the witness consciousness. The Indian philosophical tradition, particularly within the school of Advaita Vedanta, developed an analysis of the subject of experience that converges with remarkable precision on the same structural conclusion reached by the Western and Islamic philosophical traditions examined in the preceding subsections, while arriving through a completely independent route of inquiry that extends back more than 2,000 years. Advaita Vedanta, the non-dual school of Indian philosophy, whose most systematic philosophical formulation is associated with Adi Shankara in the 8th century CE, addresses the question of the subject of experience through the concept of Sakshi, the witness consciousness. The Sakshi is not one experiential state among others, not a perception, not a thought, not an emotion, not a sensation. It is the pure witnessing awareness within which all perceptions, thoughts, emotions, and sensations arise and pass away. It is the subject of experience in the most fundamental sense, the one for whom all experiential content is content, the awareness within which the entire field of experience is illuminated. The Advaita analysis of the witness consciousness arrives at a conclusion that directly parallels the conclusions of the Western philosophical tradition, while formulating it with greater positive ontological content. Like Hume, Advaita Vedanta recognizes that introspective examination of experience finds only a succession of contents, perceptions, thoughts, emotions, with no self among them. But unlike Hume, Advaita Vedanta does not conclude from this failure to find the self among the contents of experience that the self does not exist. It concludes that the self cannot be found among the contents of experience because it is not a content but the container, not an object but the subject, not something seen but the very seeing itself. Shankara's analysis of the witness consciousness employs a form of reasoning that directly parallels the method of exhaustive elimination developed in the present book. He argues that the subject of experience cannot be any of the objects it experiences because for any proposed candidate for the subject, that candidate can itself be made an object of awareness, which means it cannot be the ultimate subject. The I cannot see itself. The knowing cannot know itself as an object without presupposing a deeper knowing that knows the knowing. Any attempt to locate the subject among the objects of experience generates precisely the homunculus regress that was identified in the neuroscientific context in Section 3. The proposed subject always turns out to be another object, requiring a further subject to witness it. The regress terminates only when the witness consciousness itself is recognized as the ground of all witnessing, rather than one more object to be witnessed. This analysis converges with Kant's transcendental unity of apperception in identifying the subject as the condition of experience rather than one of its contents. But it goes significantly beyond Kant in two respects. First, where Kant leaves the transcendental subject as a formal condition without ontological content, Shankara identifies the witness consciousness positively as pure awareness, chit, one of the three fundamental characteristics of ultimate reality in the Advaita framework, alongside existence, sat, and bliss, ananda. The subject is not an empty formal condition, but the most fundamental reality, the ground of all existence and all experience. Second, where Kant explicitly excludes knowledge of the subject in itself as beyond the limits of possible experience, Advaita Vedanta proposes that the witness consciousness is the one reality that is directly and immediately self-known. It does not know itself as an object because it is not an object. It is self-luminous, svaprakasha, illuminating itself and everything else without requiring any further illumination. This concept of self-luminosity is the Advaita response to the problem identified in the preceding sections. The subject cannot be found through introspection, not because it does not exist, but because it is the very light of awareness by which introspection is conducted. You cannot see your own eye with that same eye, but the eye's existence is confirmed by its very capacity to see. The Advaita analysis also engages directly with the question of the relationship between the individual subject of experience and the ultimate ground of all reality. The central thesis of Advaita Vedanta is expressed in the Mahavakyas, the great sayings of the Upanishads, particularly Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman, and Tat Tvam Asi, that thou art. These formulations assert the identity of the individual witness consciousness, the Atman with the ultimate ground of all reality, Brahman, the infinite, unconditioned, self-luminous awareness that is the ground of all existence. The individual subject of experience is not a separate, independently existing entity, but a localization of the infinite ground of awareness within a particular experiential perspective. This Advaita conclusion converges precisely with the central thesis of the present book. The subject of experience cannot be found among the objects of experience because it is the ground within which all objects arise. The individual subject is a localization of infinite consciousness rather than an independent entity alongside it. The failure of introspection to find the subject among the contents of experience is not evidence of the subject's non-existence, but evidence of its transcendence of all object status, and the ultimate subject the witness of all witnesses, the awareness within which all individual subjects exist as localizations, is the infinite ground of all reality. The Advaita tradition calls this Brahman. The present book calls it infinite consciousness. The structural identity of these two accounts, arrived at through completely independent philosophical routes, separated by more than a millennium, and by the entire breadth of cultural and linguistic difference between ancient India and contemporary interdisciplinary philosophy, is itself a powerful instance of convergent necessity. 4.7 The Buddhist philosophical tradition, Nagarjuna and the unlocatable self. The Buddhist philosophical tradition offers a third independent line of inquiry into the question of the subject of experience, one that arrives at a conclusion structurally identical to those of the Western, Islamic, and Indian Vedantic traditions, while approaching the problem from a fundamentally different ontological starting point. Where Advaita Vedanta concludes that the failure to locate the subject among the objects of experience reveals the subject as the infinite ground of all reality, the Buddhist tradition, particularly in the Madhyamaka school, founded by Nagarjuna in the 2nd century CE, concludes that this failure reveals the absence of any substantial, independently existing self at all. Yet despite this apparently opposite conclusion, both traditions converge on the same structural finding that is central to the present book's argument. The subject of experience cannot be located within any physical, psychological, or conceptual system by any method of examination available to human inquiry. Nagarjuna, who lived and wrote in India in approximately the 2nd century CE, is widely regarded as the most philosophically rigorous thinker in the Buddhist tradition, and one of the most significant philosophers in the history of human thought. His major work, the Mulamadhyamakakarika, the Fundamental Verses on the Middle Way, applies the Buddhist method of philosophical analysis to every major category of reality, including causation, time, motion, perception, and the self, and demonstrates through exhaustive logical analysis that none of these categories possesses svabhava, inherent existence or self-nature, independently of the relational conditions that give rise to them. Nagarjuna's analysis of the self in Chapter 18 of the Mulamadhyamakakarika is the most precise Buddhist philosophical treatment of the subject of experience, and directly addresses the question of whether a locatable subject can be identified within the human person. His analysis proceeds through what is explicitly a method of exhaustive elimination, examining every possible relationship between the self and the 5 aggregates, skandhas, that constitute the human person according to Buddhist psychology: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. For each possible relationship, Nagarjuna demonstrates its logical impossibility, concluding that the self is neither identical with the aggregates nor different from them, neither contained within them nor containing them. This exhaustive elimination of every possible way of locating the self within the constituents of the human person leads Nagarjuna to his central conclusion. The self has no svabhava, no inherent existence, no self-nature that it possesses independently of the relational conditions through which it arises. This conclusion is expressed through the concept of shunyata, emptiness, which in the Madhyamaka framework does not mean that the self does not exist in any sense, but that it does not exist as a self-subsisting, independently real, locatable entity within any system of examination. The parallel with the neuroscientific and philosophical failures documented in the preceding sections of the present book is precise and direct. Neuroscience cannot locate the subject within the brain, not because the subject is not real, but because the subject is not the kind of thing that can be found by examining neural components. Hume cannot find the self through introspection, not because the self does not exist, but because the self is not among the contents of experience. Nagarjuna cannot find the self among the aggregates of the human person, not because the self is an illusion, but because the self has no inherent existence as a locatable component within any analytical framework. All three lines of inquiry arrive at the same structural finding from completely different directions. The subject of experience is not locatable within any system that examines it from the outside or from among its own contents. There is, however, a critical distinction between Nagarjuna's conclusion and the conclusion of the present book that must be stated with precision. Nagarjuna concludes that the absence of inherent existence, shunyata, is itself the ultimate nature of all phenomena, including the self. The present book concludes that the unlocatability of the subject points toward infinite consciousness as the ultimate ground of all experience. These are different positive conclusions drawn from the same structural finding. Both agree that the subject cannot be located as an independent, self-subsisting entity within any physical, psychological, or conceptual system. They differ in what they propose as the ultimate ontological account of what the subject is. This difference is philosophically significant and should not be minimized. However, it does not undermine the convergent necessity argument of the present book. The convergence that the present book invokes is convergence on the structural finding that the subject cannot be located within any system, not convergence on the positive ontological account of what the subject ultimately is. Both Nagarjuna and the present book agree on the structural finding. Their different positive accounts represent different responses to the same problem, both of which go beyond the merely negative conclusion of the Western philosophical tradition that the subject cannot be found, toward positive ontological proposals about the nature of the reality that generates this finding. Nagarjuna's analysis also contributes a specific methodological insight that directly supports the present book's argument. His exhaustive elimination of every possible relationship between the self and the aggregates demonstrates that the failure to locate the subject is not a contingent failure resulting from the limitations of any particular method of investigation. It is a necessary failure that results from the nature of the subject itself. No matter which relationship between self and aggregates is examined, no matter how the analysis is conducted, the self resists location as an inherently existing entity. This necessity of failure is precisely what the present book argues about the neuroscientific and philosophical searches for the subject. The failure is not contingent but structural, not a temporary gap in knowledge, but a permanent feature of the relationship between the subject and any method that attempts to examine it as an object. 4.8. The Chinese philosophical tradition, Zhuangzi and the unlocatable true ruler. The Chinese philosophical tradition, particularly within the classical Taoist school, developed an analysis of the subject of experience that converges with remarkable precision on the same structural finding encountered in the Western, Islamic, and Indian philosophical traditions examined in the preceding subsections. The 4th century BCE philosopher Zhuangzi, whose work constitutes one of the foundational texts of Taoist philosophy and one of the most philosophically rich works in the entire history of Chinese thought, directly confronted the question of the subject of experience and arrived at a conclusion that the present book's argument illuminates with new precision. Zhuangzi's engagement with the question of the subject of experience appears most directly in the 2nd chapter of the Zhuangzi, the Qiwulun, or discussion on making all things equal, in a passage that has been described by scholars as one of the most philosophically dense and significant in the entire classical Chinese corpus. Zhuangzi asks, "There is a true ruler, and whether or not its reality is verified makes no difference to its genuineness. Once we have received this body, we go on running until we stop. Are we not sad? We toil all our lives without seeing success. We wear ourselves out without knowing where to go. Can we not call this pitiable? But what is to be called not dying, since the body transforms? Is this not a great sadness? Is human life always so deluded? Am I alone deluded, and some people not?" The philosophical significance of this passage for the question of the subject of experience is precise and direct. Zhuangzi posits the existence of a true ruler, zhenzai, within the human person, a genuine governing principle or subject that is distinct from any of the organs, faculties, or processes of the body and mind. He then immediately raises the question of whether this true ruler can be located within any of the physical or psychological components of the person. His answer, developed through the broader context of the Qiwulun chapter, is that the true ruler cannot be found among the things it governs. It is present and operative, genuinely real in its effects, yet unlocatable as a specific component within any system of analysis. This argument has a precise structural parallel with the homunculus regress identified in Section 3 of the present book. Any proposed candidate for the true ruler, any specific organ, faculty, or psychological process proposed as the seat of the governing subject, immediately raises the question of what governs that candidate. The eye sees, but cannot see itself seeing. The mind knows, but cannot know itself knowing as an object among other objects. The controller cannot be found among the things it controls, because the controller is always already presupposed by any act of examination, including the examination that seeks to locate it. Zhuangzi develops this analysis further through his famous butterfly dream passage in the same text. He writes, "Once upon a time I, Zhuangzi, dreamt I was a butterfly fluttering hither and thither, to all intents and purposes a butterfly. I was conscious only of my happiness as a butterfly, unaware that I was Zhuangzi. Soon I awaked, and there lay Zhuangzi on his bed. But I could not tell whether I was Zhuangzi who had dreamt he was a butterfly, or whether I was a butterfly now dreaming I was Zhuangzi." The philosophical point of this passage for the present analysis is precise. The subject of experience, the one who dreams and the one who wakes, is not identical with any specific content of experience, whether the butterfly experience or the Zhuangzi experience. The subject persists through the transition between these radically different experiential contents without itself being any of those contents. Yet when Zhuangzi attempts to identify the subject, to determine whether it is the man or the butterfly, he finds that the subject cannot be pinned down as either. It is what both experiences are experiences for, without itself being either experience. This convergence with the Western philosophical tradition is striking and worth making explicit. Zhuangzi's butterfly dream raises the same question as Descartes' method of radical doubt. What is the subject of experience that persists through radically different experiential states? But where Descartes resolves the question by positing the thinking substance as the subject, and then attempting to locate it in the pineal gland, Zhuangzi refuses any such localization. The subject is genuinely present. The transition between butterfly and man is a real transition for someone, but that someone cannot be identified with either experiential state or located within any physical or psychological system. Zhuangzi's analysis also converges with the Advaita Vedantic analysis of the witness consciousness, Sakshi, examined in the preceding subsection. Both traditions identify a subject of experience that is present and operative throughout all experiential states without being identical with any of them. Both recognize that the subject cannot be located among the objects of experience because it is the condition of their appearing as objects. And both resist the Western philosophical tendency to resolve this recognition by either positing a substantial self as the subject or eliminating the subject altogether. The subject is real, it is present, it is the true ruler of the person or the witness of all experience, but it cannot be found by any method that looks for it among the things it governs or the contents it witnesses. The Chinese philosophical tradition through Zhuangzi therefore contributes to the convergent necessity argument of the present book, a fourth independent line of inquiry that arrives at the same structural finding as the Western, Islamic, and Indian traditions. The subject of experience is present and genuinely real in its effects, but unlocatable as a specific component within any physical, psychological, or conceptual system of analysis. The true ruler is there. Every human being knows it is there because every human being is governed by it in every moment of experience. But no examination of the components of the human person, whether conducted by neuroscience, philosophy, introspection, or logical analysis, can locate it among those components. It is always already doing the examining. 4.9 The Sufi mystical tradition, Fana and the ultimate subject. The Sufi mystical tradition within Islam represents perhaps the most experientially grounded and philosophically precise convergence with the central argument of the present book. Where the philosophical traditions examined in the preceding subsections arrive at the conclusion that the subject of experience cannot be located within any physical, psychological, or conceptual system through the route of logical analysis and introspective examination. The Sufi tradition arrives at the same conclusion through the route of direct experiential inquiry, the systematic investigation of the nature of the self through contemplative practice, spiritual discipline, and the guidance of the teacher-student transmission that has characterized Sufi inquiry since its earliest expressions in the 8th and 9th centuries CE. The central concept through which the Sufi tradition addresses the question of the subject of experience is fana, a term derived from the Arabic root meaning to pass away, to cease, to be annihilated. Fana refers to the passing away or dissolution of the apparent individual subject in the divine presence, the experiential recognition that the apparent independently existing self has no genuine ontological status apart from the divine ground from which it arises and within which it exists. The most celebrated early expression of this recognition is associated with the 9th century CE Sufi martyr Mansur al-Hallaj, whose proclamation Ana al-Haq, I am the truth or I am the real, was interpreted by his contemporaries as the blasphemous claim of individual identity with God, but is more precisely understood as the experiential recognition that the ultimate subject of his experience was not the individual ego, but the divine reality itself. The philosophical significance of fana for the question of the subject of experience is precise and directly relevant to the present book's argument. The Sufi analysis does not claim that the individual subject is eliminated or destroyed in the state of fana. It claims that the apparent independence of the individual subject is recognized as illusory, that what appeared to be an independently existing individual subject is revealed through direct experience to be a localization of the divine ground rather than a separate entity alongside it. The individual subject does not disappear. It is recognized as what it always already was, a temporary perspective of the infinite subject, a localized expression of the divine awareness that is the ultimate ground of all experience. This is precisely the conclusion of the present book arrived at through philosophical and scientific argument. There is no individual subject of experience. The dominant self, the person, the psyche, the brain, and every other level of the apparent individual's architecture are not subjects of experience at any level, immediate or ultimate. None of them generate experience from within themselves. None of them are independently existing entities that possess experience as their own property. They are all instruments, channels, and configurations through which the sole subject of all experience, infinite consciousness, experiences its own creative activity from a particular localized vantage point. The four-layered architecture of the person, from the most enclosed outer self to the most transparent real self, is the specific structural mechanism through which infinite consciousness localizes its experiencing within a particular person, with the dominant self as the active layer of that mechanism at any given moment, and the real self as the most direct interface between the localized configuration and the infinite ground. But the subject that experiences through this mechanism is not the mechanism itself. It is infinite consciousness, the infinite ground within which the person arises as a thought, a code, a temporary configuration of the infinite whole's creative activity. The Sufi tradition confirms through direct experiential inquiry what the present book establishes through logical argument and scientific evidence. The sole and only subject of all experience is not the individual person, not any layer of the individual person's psychological architecture, not the dominant self, not even the real self, but the infinite ground itself within which every individual person, every self, and every moment of experience arises, is sustained, and dissolves back into the awareness that was always and only the subject of everything that ever occurred within it. The most philosophically developed Sufi account of the relationship between the individual subject and the ultimate subject is found in the work of Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, the 12th and 13th century Andalusian mystic and philosopher whose influence on the Islamic intellectual tradition is comparable in scope and depth to Aristotle's influence on the Western tradition. Ibn Arabi's concept of the perfect human being, Al-Insan al-Kamil, directly addresses the question of the subject of experience. The perfect human being is not a particular individual who achieves a special spiritual state, but the human being who has recognized their essential nature as a mirror of the divine attributes, a localization of the infinite ground's self-knowledge rather than an independent entity alongside it. Ibn Arabi's analysis of the relationship between the individual subject and the divine ground also directly parallels the for-self architecture of Wadat al-Khail. He distinguishes between the zahir, the outward or manifest dimension of the human person that corresponds to the outer self of the present framework, and the batin, the inward or hidden dimension that corresponds to the deeper layers of the self, including the real self at the boundary with infinite consciousness. The journey from zahir to batin is the journey from outer self-dominance to real self-dominance, from the most enclosed and opaque layer of the self to the most transparent and open layer, the layer at which the individual subject most directly participates in the infinite ground of all experience. The Sufi tradition also addresses directly the question of why the ultimate subject cannot be found through ordinary examination. The concept of hijab, the veil between the human being and the divine reality, is the Sufi formulation of the same structural feature of localized experience that the present book identifies as the evolutionary and logical necessity of the individual subject's self-enclosure. The veil exists not as an obstacle imposed from outside, but as the structural condition of possibility for the individual subject's existence as a distinct experiential perspective. Without the veil, there would be no individual subject to have the experience of removing the veil. The veil is the localization itself, the very feature of individual existence that makes individual experience possible. The convergence between the Sufi tradition and the present book's argument is therefore not merely thematic or analogical. It is structural and precise. Both identify the individual subject as a localization of the infinite ground. Both recognize the veil or constraint that prevents the individual subject from ordinarily recognizing its own infinite ground. Both propose that the deepest layer of the human person, whether called the real self or the batin or the divine spark, is the point at which the individual subject participates most directly in the infinite ground. And both conclude that the ultimate subject of all experience is not the individual person, but the infinite awareness that generates, sustains, and experiences through every individual person simultaneously. Yet the convergence between the Sufi tradition and the present book, while genuine and structurally precise, must not obscure the significant differences between the two frameworks in method, scope, and the nature of the claims being made. These differences are not incidental. They constitute the specific contribution of the present book beyond what the Sufi tradition itself provides. The first and most fundamental difference is methodological. The Sufi tradition arrives at its conclusions through the route of direct experiential inquiry, contemplative practice, spiritual discipline, and mystical transmission. Its claims are grounded in and verified by transformative inner experience rather than by logical argument or empirical evidence. This gives Sufi knowledge a depth and immediacy that philosophical argument cannot replicate, but also limits its accessibility and verifiability to those who have undergone the specific experiential path through which its insights are accessed. The present book, makes no appeal to mystical experience as a basis for its claims. Every argument it advances is grounded in logical necessity, empirical evidence, or both, and is in principle verifiable by any reader through the application of the same reasoning to the same evidence regardless of their spiritual background, religious commitments, or experiential history. This methodological difference means that the present book reaches the same structural conclusion as the Sufi tradition through a completely different epistemic route, one that is accessible to any serious intellectual inquirer rather than only to those who have undergone a specific contemplative path. The second difference concerns the scope of the argument. The Sufi tradition addresses the question of the subject of experience within a specific theological and metaphysical framework grounded in Islamic revelation and the authority of the prophetic tradition. Its account of fana, of the divine ground, and of the relationship between the individual subject and the ultimate subject is developed within and cannot be fully separated from this theological context. The present book develops its argument entirely without appeal to revelation, religious authority, or theological commitment. It builds its case through philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, and artificial intelligence research, disciplines whose conclusions are in principle independent of any religious tradition, and whose evidence is available to scholars across all cultural and religious backgrounds. This means the present book's argument for infinite consciousness as the ultimate subject of experience is not the same claim as the Sufi claim for divine unity, even though the two claims converge structurally. The present book's infinite consciousness is reached through the exhaustive elimination of all alternative accounts of the subject and the convergence of all independent lines of evidence, not through theological deduction from revelation or mystical recognition in contemplative experience. The third difference concerns the architecture of the individual subject. The Sufi tradition, for all its profound insight into the relationship between the individual subject and the divine ground, does not provide a systematic psychological account of the internal structure of the individual subject. It identifies the zahir and the batin, the outward and the inward dimensions of the human person, and it recognizes different stages of spiritual development through which the individual subject progressively recognizes its divine ground. But it does not offer the architecturally precise account of selfhood that the present book develops through the Wahdat al-Kayal framework, the four-layered structure of the outer self, inner self, ideal self, and real self, each with its own nature, its own bodily connection, its own form of intelligence, and its own domain of psychosocial health and illness. This four-self architecture is the specific original contribution of the present book and of the Wahdat al-Kayal framework upon which it builds. It provides what the Sufi tradition gestures toward but does not systematically develop: a complete ontological psychology of the self that maps the precise structure of the human person's relationship to infinite consciousness and provides a clinically applicable framework for understanding and addressing the full range of human psychological health and illness. The fourth difference concerns the question of verification. The Sufi tradition's claims about fana and the divine ground are in principle verifiable only through the experiential path that leads to fana itself. One cannot verify the claim that the ultimate subject of experience is the divine ground without undergoing the transformative experiential journey through which that recognition arises. The present book's claims, by contrast, are verifiable through logical analysis, empirical evidence, and the convergence of independent disciplinary findings. The reader does not need to meditate, practice spiritual disciplines, or undergo any form of experiential transformation to follow the argument and assess its validity. The argument stands or falls on its logical coherence and its fidelity to the evidence, both of which are accessible by any intellectually rigorous reader. These four differences do not diminish the significance of the convergence between the Sufi tradition and the present book. They clarify the nature of that convergence and specify what it means. The convergence is not identity. The present book is not Sufism in philosophical dress. It is an independent philosophical and scientific argument that arrives at a structurally similar conclusion through a completely different epistemic route. The convergence between the two frameworks is itself an instance of the convergent necessity that the book invokes as its primary methodological resource. When independent lines of inquiry originating from completely different starting points and proceeding through completely different methods arrive at the same structural conclusion, that convergence is powerful evidence that the conclusion tracks something real about the nature of the subject under investigation. The Sufi tradition and the present book are two of those independent lines. Their convergence strengthens both. 4.1 The Christian Mystical Tradition, Meister Eckhart and the Ground of the Soul. The Christian mystical tradition, particularly as developed by the Rhineland mystic Meister Eckhart in the 13th and 14th centuries CE, contributes a fifth independent line of inquiry into the question of the subject of experience that converges with remarkable precision on the same structural conclusion reached by the Western philosophical, Islamic philosophical, Indian Vedantic, Buddhist, Taoist, and Sufi traditions examined in the preceding subsections. Eckhart's philosophical theology represents one of the most intellectually rigorous and philosophically sophisticated treatments of the subject of experience in the entire history of Christian thought, and his central concepts bear a structural relationship to the argument of the present book that is too precise to be merely coincidental. Meister Eckhart, born in Thuringia in approximately 1260 CE and dying in approximately 1328 CE, was a Dominican friar, theologian, and preacher who developed within the framework of Christian scholastic theology a mystical philosophy of extraordinary depth and originality. His work draws on the Neoplatonic tradition, particularly Plotinus and Proclus as mediated through Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, on the Aristotelian scholasticism of Thomas Aquinas, and on his own direct contemplative experience, weaving these sources into a unified vision of the relationship between the human soul and God that challenged conventional theological categories and eventually brought him into conflict with the ecclesiastical authorities of his time. The central concept of Eckhart's analysis of the subject of experience is the Grund, a Middle High German term meaning ground, foundation, or depth. Eckhart uses this term in two related but distinct senses that are crucial for understanding its relevance to the present book's argument. The first sense is the Grund der Seele, the ground of the soul, the deepest and most fundamental dimension of the human person, the point at which the soul is most fully itself and most completely present to its own being. The second sense is the Gottheit, the Godhead or divine ground, the ultimate reality that underlies and precedes all the attributes and activities of God as traditionally conceived. Eckhart's most radical and philosophically significant claim is that these two grounds are ultimately one. The ground of the soul and the ground of God are the same ground. The parallel with the present book's argument is structurally exact. The ground of the soul in Eckhart's framework corresponds precisely to the real self in the four-self architecture of Wadat al-Khail, the deepest layer of the human person's being, the point at which the individual subject participates most directly in the infinite ground of all reality, the thinnest boundary between the localized perspective and the infinite whole. The divine ground in Eckhart's framework corresponds precisely to what the present book calls infinite consciousness, the uncaused, self-subsisting, omnipresent awareness within which all apparent multiplicity arises as a differentiated expression of the infinite whole's creative activity. And Eckhart's claim that these two grounds are ultimately one corresponds precisely to the present book's claim that the real self is not a separate entity alongside infinite consciousness, but the point of the individual subject's most direct participation in it. Eckhart develops his analysis of the grunt through a specific philosophical method that directly parallels the method of exhaustive elimination employed in the present book. He proceeds by systematically stripping away every attribute, every quality, every distinguishing characteristic that could be predicated of the ultimate subject, arguing that the ground of the soul cannot be identified with any specific faculty, capacity, or activity of the human person, because it is the ground from which all such faculties, capacities, and activities arise. It is not the intellect, not the will, not memory, not sensation, not emotion, not any of the psychological faculties that constitute the human person's active engagement with the world. It is what all of these arise from, the condition of their possibility rather than one of their expressions. This methodological parallel with exhaustive elimination is precise. Just as the present book proceeds by eliminating every proposed candidate for the subject of experience, demonstrating that no neural process, no philosophical construct, no functional system, and no locatable entity within any physical system is the subject, Eckhart proceeds by eliminating every proposed identification of the grunt with any specific faculty or attribute of the soul, demonstrating that the ground of the soul cannot be any of the things the soul does or has, but only what the soul most fundamentally is at its deepest and most silent level. The grunt is reached not by addition, by identifying more and more sophisticated candidates for the ultimate subject, but by subtraction, by stripping away every candidate until what remains is the naked ground itself. Eckhart also addresses directly the question of why the ground of the soul cannot be found through ordinary introspective examination, the same question that Hume's failure raises. His answer is precise and philosophically sophisticated. The ground of the soul cannot be found through introspective examination, because introspective examination is itself an activity of the soul, and all activities of the soul arise from and are posterior to the ground. To look for the ground through introspection is to use the ground to look for itself, which means the ground is always already doing the looking and therefore cannot appear as an object of what it is doing. This is the same structural point made earlier in relation to Hume. the subject cannot find itself through the introspective examination of its own contents, because it is the condition of that examination rather than one of its objects. Eckhart expresses this point through the concept of Abgeschiedenheit, detachment or releasement, the condition in which the soul releases its attachment to all specific contents of experience and rests in the naked ground itself. In the state of Abgeschiedenheit, the soul does not find the ground as an object of its attention, because in that state there is no longer a subject attending to an object. There is only the ground itself, aware of itself without the mediation of any specific content, faculty, or activity. This state is not the elimination of experience, but its most fundamental form, pure awareness without any particular object, the subject of experience recognizing itself as the ground of all experience rather than as one of its contents. The convergence between Eckhart's Christian mystical philosophy and the present book's argument is therefore not merely analogical. It is structurally precise at the level of the specific philosophical claims being made about the nature of the subject of experience, the method by which those claims are established, and the relationship between the individual subject and the infinite ground. Eckhart arrives at these conclusions through a combination of Christian theological reflection, Neoplatonic philosophical analysis, and direct contemplative experience. The present book arrives at structurally identical conclusions through logical argument, neuroscientific evidence, philosophical analysis, and artificial intelligence research. The independence of these two routes and the precision of their convergence is itself a significant instance of the convergent necessity that the present book invokes as its primary methodological resource. As with the Sufi tradition examined in the preceding subsection, however, the convergence between Eckhart's Christian mystical philosophy and the present book must not obscure the significant differences between them. Eckhart works within a specifically Christian theological framework grounded in the authority of scripture, tradition, and contemplative experience, and his claims are inseparable from that framework. The present book makes no appeal to theological authority or contemplative experience. Its claims are grounded exclusively in logical argument and empirical evidence, accessible to any intellectually rigorous reader regardless of religious background. Furthermore, Eckhart does not provide the architecturally precise psychological account of the four-self structure that the present book develops through Wadat al-Khail. His grunt is a profound and precisely formulated concept, but it remains within the framework of mystical theology rather than developing into a complete ontological psychology with clinical applications. The present book provides this development, moving from the mystical insight that the ground of the soul is the ultimate subject of experience to a systematic account of the four-layered architecture through which infinite consciousness localizes itself within the human person, and a clinically applicable framework for understanding and addressing the full range of human psychological health and illness. 4.11 The Jewish Mystical Tradition, Kabbalah, Ein Sof, and the Tzimtzum. The Jewish mystical tradition, particularly as developed within the Kabbalistic schools of medieval Spain and 16th century Safed in the land of Israel, contributes a sixth independent line of inquiry into the question of the subject of experience that converges with the argument of the present book through a distinctive and philosophically precise account of the relationship between the infinite ground of all reality and the individual subjects of experience that arise within it. The Kabbalistic tradition is unique among the traditions examined in this section, in that it addresses not only the question of what the ultimate subject of experience is, but also the question of how individual localized subjects arise within an infinite ground, providing a metaphysical account of the mechanism of localization that converges with remarkable precision on the account developed in the present book through the framework of Wadat al-Kayl. The foundational concept of Kabbalistic metaphysics is Ein Sof, a Hebrew phrase meaning without end or the infinite, which designates the ultimate ground of all reality prior to and beyond all attributes, all qualities, all distinguishing characteristics, and all relationships. Ein Sof is not God as traditionally conceived within Jewish theology, as a personal being with specific attributes and a particular relationship to the created world. It is the infinite ground that precedes and underlies all such conceptions, the reality that is so utterly beyond all categories of thought and language that it cannot be said to exist in the way that any particular thing exists, nor can it be said not to exist. It is the ground of existence itself, rather than one existing thing among others. The parallel with the present book's concept of infinite consciousness is structurally precise. Like Ein Sof, infinite consciousness in the present framework is not one conscious being among others, but the ground of all consciousness, the awareness within which all apparent subjects and objects arise as temporary configurations of its creative activity. Like Ein Sof, infinite consciousness cannot be located within any system because it is the ground within which all systems arise. Like Ein Sof, infinite consciousness is beyond all attributes and categories, while being the source from which all attributes and categories derive their reality. The structural identity of these two concepts, arrived at through completely independent traditions separated by centuries and by the entire breadth of cultural and linguistic difference between medieval Jewish mysticism and contemporary interdisciplinary philosophy, is itself a significant instance of the convergent necessity that the present book invokes as its primary methodological resource. The most philosophically significant Kabbalistic contribution to the question of how individual subjects of experience arise within the infinite ground is the concept of tzimtzum, divine contraction or withdrawal, developed by Rabbi Isaac Luria of Safed in the 16th century CE. Luria addressed a problem that had occupied Jewish mystical theology since its earliest expressions. If Ein Sof is truly infinite, filling all reality without remainder, how can anything other than Ein Sof exist? How can individual subjects of experience, finite and bounded, arise within a ground that is infinite and unbounded? The answer Luria proposed is the tzimtzum. Ein Sof contracted or withdrew into itself, creating a primordial space, a teharu or vacant space, within which the finite world, including individual subjects of experience, could arise as genuine realities rather than merely as aspects of the infinite whole. The parallel with the present book's account of localization is structurally exact and philosophically illuminating. The present book argues that infinite consciousness must localize itself, adopting finite perspectives through which particular configurations of its creative activity are experienced as foreground against a receding background, in order to experience the multiplicity of its own creative activity. The localization is not a diminishment of the infinite whole, but a structural necessity of differentiated experience. Without localization, there can be no variety, no contrast, no relation, no particular perspective, and therefore no experience in the phenomenal sense at all. The Lurianic Tzimtzum is a precise metaphysical expression of this same structural necessity. The infinite ground must contract or withdraw in order to create the space within which finite individual subjects can exist as genuine perspectives, rather than being simply absorbed into the infinite whole. The Tzimtzum concept also addresses directly the question of why individual subjects of experience cannot recognize the infinite ground within which they exist, a question that the present book addresses through the concept of the structural constraint on self-negating thought. In the Lurianic framework, the contraction of Ein Sof creates not only the space for individual existence, but also the epistemic distance that makes individual subjects unaware of the infinite ground from which they arise. The vessels, kelim, that contain the divine light within the finite world are precisely the structures that both enable individual existence and limit the individual subject's awareness of the infinite source from which its existence derives. The breaking of the vessels, the Shevarat Haklim, which is another central concept of Lurianic Kabbalah, represents the moment at which the structures of individual limitation are disrupted, allowing the divine light to overflow the boundaries of individual existence and be recognized in its infinite character. This Lurianic account converges precisely with the present book's account of the four-self architecture and the movement from outer self-dominance to real self-dominance. The outer self is the vessel most fully formed, most opaque to the infinite ground, most enclosed within the structures of individual limitation. The real self is the vessel most transparent, most open to the infinite ground, the point at which the divine light flows most directly from its infinite source into the individual person's experience. The movement from outer self-dominance to real self-dominance is the psychological equivalent of the tikkun, the repair or restoration, that Lurianic Kabbalah proposes as the purpose of human existence. The progressive restoration of the divine light to its infinite source through the transformation of the individual subject's relationship to the ground within which it exists. The Zohar, the foundational text of Kabbalistic literature, compiled in 13th century Spain and attributed within the tradition to the 2nd century CE sage Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, also addresses the question of the subject of experience in a way that directly parallels the present book's argument. The Zohar's concept of the neshama, the highest dimension of the human soul, as a spark of the divine light that remains always connected to its infinite source, directly parallels the concept of the real self in the four-self architecture. The dimension of the human person that is never fully enclosed within the structures of individual limitation, that always maintains its connection to the infinite ground, and through which the individual subject participates most directly in the awareness of infinite consciousness. The Kabbalistic tradition therefore contributes to the convergent necessity argument of the present book, both a metaphysical account of the ultimate subject as the infinite ground of all reality, Ein Sof, and a specific account of the mechanism through which individual localized subjects arise within that infinite ground, tzimtzum, that converges with remarkable precision on the account developed in the present book through the Wadat al-Kayal framework. This double convergence on both the ultimate subject and the mechanism of localization makes the Kabbalistic tradition one of the most philosophically rich and directly relevant of the non-Western traditions examined in this chapter for the argument of the present book. As with the Sufi and Christian mystical traditions examined in the preceding subsections, however, the convergence between Kabbalistic thought and the present book must not obscure the significant differences between them. The Kabbalistic tradition develops its account of Ein Sof and Tzimtzum within a specifically Jewish theological framework grounded in the authority of Torah, Talmud, and mystical transmission, and its claims are inseparable from that theological context. The present book makes no appeal to theological authority or religious tradition. Its argument for infinite consciousness as the ultimate subject of experience is grounded exclusively in logical argument and empirical evidence. Furthermore, the Kabbalistic tradition, like the Sufi and Christian mystical traditions, does not provide the architecturally precise psychological account of the four-self structure that the present book develops through Wadat al-Kayal. The Tzimtzum and the Shevarat Haklim are profound and illuminating metaphysical concepts, but they remain within the framework of mystical theology rather than developing into a complete ontological psychology with clinical applications. The present book provides this development, moving from the metaphysical insight that individual subjects arise through a process of localization within an infinite ground to a systematic account of the four-layered architecture of that localization, and a clinically applicable framework for understanding and addressing the full range of human psychological health and illness. 4.12 The 20th Century, Phenomenology and the Irreducibility of Experience. The phenomenological tradition, initiated by Husserl 1913 and developed by Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, and Sartre, shifted philosophical attention from the logical structure of experience to its lived character, its concrete texture as it is actually undergone by an embodied subject in a world. This shift produced important insights about the nature of experience that the more abstract traditions had missed. Husserl 1913 identified intentionality, the essential directedness of consciousness toward objects, as the fundamental structure of experience. Consciousness is never a blank awareness, but always awareness of something, always directed toward an object from a particular vantage point. This directedness presupposes a subject who is directed, a center from which the directedness originates. Yet Husserl's attempt to identify this subject through the method of phenomenological reduction, the bracketing of all assumptions about the external world in order to examine pure consciousness, encountered the same difficulty as Hume's introspection. The subject of experience is never itself an object of the reduction. It is always the one performing the reduction. Merleau-Ponty, 1945, grounded the subject of experience in the lived body, arguing that all experience is experience from a bodily situation, a specific location in the world from which some things are near and others distant, some salient and others receding. This was an important corrective to the Cartesian tendency to treat the subject as a disembodied thinking thing. Yet locating the subject in the lived body does not resolve the question of what the subject is. The lived body is itself experienced. Something experiences the body from within. That something is the subject, and it is not identical with the body it inhabits and through which it experiences the world. Sartre, 1936, distinguished between pre-reflective consciousness, the consciousness that is always already present, as the condition of reflection without itself being an object of reflection, and reflective consciousness, the consciousness that takes itself as its own object. The pre-reflective consciousness is never caught as an object because it is always already the subject doing the catching. This is the nearest that phenomenological philosophy comes to identifying the structural reason for the subject's unlocatability. The subject is always already doing the looking and therefore cannot find itself among the things looked at. Yet Sartre did not extend this insight to its ultimate conclusion, remaining within the framework of individual human consciousness without asking what grounds that consciousness in a reality beyond itself. The phenomenological tradition represents the closest approach that Western philosophy has made to the central question of the present book, and it is precisely this closeness that makes the differences between phenomenology and the present book's argument both important and necessary to articulate with precision. The convergence between phenomenological analysis and the present book is genuine and significant. Both identify the subject of experience as irreducible to any object of experience. Both recognize that the subject is always already doing the examining and therefore cannot find itself among the things examined. Both reject the Cartesian tendency to treat the subject as a disembodied thinking thing locatable at a specific anatomical address. And both insist on the first-person, irreducibly subjective character of experience as a starting point for any adequate account of consciousness. Yet the differences between phenomenology and the present book are equally significant and equally precise, and failing to articulate them would risk presenting the present book as merely a variation on phenomenological themes rather than an original contribution that builds upon and goes beyond what phenomenology achieves. The first and most fundamental difference is methodological. Phenomenology proceeds through the first-person method of phenomenological reduction and careful description of the structures of experience as they present themselves to a rigorous first-person observer. Its claims are grounded in and verified by the quality of their descriptive fidelity to experience. A phenomenological analysis is compelling to the extent that it accurately captures what experience is like from the inside. The present book proceeds through a completely different epistemic route. It employs the method of exhaustive elimination combined with convergent necessity, presenting and eliminating all alternative accounts of the subject of experience through logical argument and empirical evidence, and converging on its conclusion through multiple independent disciplinary lines, including neuroscience, philosophy of mind, artificial intelligence research, information theory, quantum physics, and ontological psychology. The present book's conclusion is therefore not a description of how experience presents itself to careful first-person observation. It is a logical demonstration of what the subject of experience must be given the structural failure of every alternative account, a demonstration that is in principle accessible to any intellectually rigorous reader, regardless of their capacity for phenomenological sensitivity or their experience with contemplative introspection. The second difference concerns the scope of the positive ontological account provided. Phenomenology identifies the structural features of the subject of experience with extraordinary precision and descriptive richness. Husserl's analysis of intentionality, temporality, and intersubjectivity, Merleau-Ponty's analysis of embodiment and bodily situatedness, Sartre's analysis of pre-reflective consciousness and its distinction from reflective consciousness. All of these are genuine and important contributions to our understanding of the structures through which the subject of experience operates. But phenomenology does not provide a positive ontological account of what the subject ultimately is beyond its structural features. Husserl's transcendental ego is a formal condition of experience without ontological content, a precisely drawn empty box in the formulation of the present book. Merleau-Ponty's embodied subject is grounded in the lived body without asking what the subject is beyond its bodily situatedness. Sartre's pre-reflective consciousness is identified as the ground of all reflection, without asking what grounds that consciousness in a reality beyond the individual human being. The present book goes beyond phenomenology precisely by providing the positive ontological account that phenomenology approaches but does not reach. Infinite consciousness as the ultimate ground of all subjectivity, and the four-layered architecture of the outer self, inner self, ideal self, and real self as the precise structural mechanism through which infinite consciousness localizes itself within individual human persons, generating the specific qualities of experience, decision, action, thought, and response that constitute a human life. The third difference concerns the relationship between the individual subject and the ground within which it exists. Phenomenology, even in its most radical formulations, remains within the horizon of individual human consciousness. Husserl's transcendental reduction leads to the discovery of pure consciousness as the ground of all experience, but this pure consciousness is still the consciousness of an individual transcendental subject, rather than the infinite ground within which individual subjects exist as localizations. Merleau-Ponty's embodied subject is always a specific body in a specific situation, a finite perspective irreducibly embedded in a particular world. Sartre's pre-reflective consciousness is the consciousness of a specific individual human being confronting its radical freedom and its fundamental project of self-creation. None of the major phenomenologists asks the question that the present book places at the center of its inquiry: what grounds individual human consciousness in a reality beyond itself? What is the subject of experience before and beneath its individual human expressions? The present book answers this question directly and precisely. The individual subject of experience is a localization of infinite consciousness, a thought of the infinite mind given a psyche to perceive itself as distinct, and the ultimate subject of all experience is the infinite consciousness that thinks every individual subject into existence and sustains every individual subject in existence through the continuous activity of its creative thought. The fourth difference concerns the internal architecture of the subject of experience. Phenomenology describes the structural features of experience with great descriptive richness, but does not provide an architecturally precise account of the internal layered structure of the subject itself. It does not identify the four distinct layers of the self, each with its own nature, its own bodily connection, its own form of intelligence, and its own domain of psychosocial health and illness, that the present book develops through the Wadatal-Kyle framework. It does not identify the dominant self as the dynamic, shifting locus of active subjectivity that moves between layers depending on circumstances. It does not identify the real self as the interface between the individual subject and the infinite ground, the thinnest boundary between the localized perspective and infinite consciousness. These architectural features are the specific original contribution of the present book and of the Wadatal-Kyle framework upon which it builds. They cannot be derived from or reduced to any phenomenological analysis, however precise and illuminating that analysis may be. The fifth difference concerns clinical applicability. Phenomenology has generated important insights for psychotherapy through existential and phenomenological approaches to clinical practice, including the work of Ludwig Binswanger, Medard Boss, and more recently Thomas Fuchs, and others working at the intersection of phenomenology and psychiatry. These approaches have contributed genuine and valuable clinical insights. But phenomenology has not generated the architecturally precise diagnostic framework across 8 domains of psychosocial health, the specific account of the causal chain from interself conflict to mental disorder, or the clinically applicable hierarchy of therapeutic interventions from surface symptom management to real self-reconnection that the present book develops through the 4-self architecture and the 8 intelligence framework. The clinical contribution of the present book goes beyond what phenomenological psychotherapy has achieved, not by replacing it, but by grounding it within a more complete ontological account of the subject that specifies the precise architecture of selfhood, the precise mechanism through which conflicts between layers of the self generate psychological disorder, and the precise nature of the therapeutic work required at each level of the self's architecture. These 5 differences do not diminish the genuine convergence between phenomenology and the present book, or the genuine debt that the present book owes to the phenomenological tradition's rigorous and illuminating analysis of the structures of experience. They clarify the nature of that convergence and specify what the present book contributes beyond what phenomenology achieves. Phenomenology clears the ground with extraordinary precision, establishing the irreducibility of the first-person perspective, the structural features of intentional consciousness, the embodied character of all experience, and the unlocatability of the subject among the objects it examines. The present book builds on this cleared ground to provide what phenomenology does not: a logically demonstrated positive ontological account of what the subject of experience ultimately is, a precise architectural account of how infinite consciousness localizes itself within individual human persons, and a clinically applicable framework for understanding and addressing the full range of human psychological health and illness in light of this ontological account. 4.13 The Analytic Tradition, the Hard Problem and its Implications. The analytic philosophy of mind in the second half of the 20th century brought the problem of the subject into its sharpest contemporary focus. Nagel, 1974, demonstrated that subjective experience has an irreducibly first-person character that cannot be captured by any third-person scientific description. His argument that there is something it is like to be a bat, and that this something is entirely inaccessible to any objective description of the bat's neural and behavioral architecture, established a permanent asymmetry between the first-person and third-person perspectives that no philosophical account has successfully bridged. Jackson, 1986, extended this through the knowledge argument. Mary, the color scientist, knows everything there is to know about the physics of light and the neuroscience of color perception, but has never seen red. When she first sees red, she learns something new, what red looks like. This demonstrates that phenomenal knowledge of what an experience is like, is not reducible to physical or functional knowledge, no matter how complete. The subject of experience has access to a dimension of reality that no third-person description can capture. Levine, 1983, 2001, identified an explanatory gap between physical descriptions and phenomenal experience that no causal or functional account has successfully bridged. Even if we knew exactly which physical processes cause pain, this would not explain why those processes are accompanied by the felt quality of painfulness, rather than by no experience at all or by a different experience. The gap between the physical description and the phenomenal reality is not merely a gap in our current knowledge. It is a gap in the kind of explanation that physical descriptions can in principle provide. Chalmers, 1995, 1996, formalized all of these insights into what he called the hard problem of consciousness, explaining why any physical process is accompanied by subjective experience at all. The easy problems of consciousness, explaining the functional capacities and behavioral dispositions associated with consciousness, are genuinely tractable by scientific methods. The hard problem is not tractable by those methods because it concerns the very existence of subjective experience rather than its functional role. Chalmers further noted that even a philosophical zombie, a being physically identical to a human being but lacking inner experience, is conceivable without logical contradiction, which implies that the subject of experience is not entailed by any physical or functional description. The analytic philosophy of mind, particularly through the contributions of Nagel, Jackson, Levine, and Chalmers, examined in the preceding section, represents the most rigorous and precisely formulated contemporary engagement with the problem of the subject of experience available within the Western philosophical tradition. Its contribution to the present book's argument is substantial and direct. It establishes with logical precision that the subject of experience is irreducible to any physical or functional description, that the first-person perspective cannot be captured by any third-person account, and that the hard problem of consciousness is not a temporary gap in our knowledge, but a structural feature of the relationship between physical descriptions and phenomenal reality. Yet the analytic tradition's engagement with these problems, for all its rigor and precision, stops at precisely the point where the present book's argument begins. The differences between the analytic tradition and the present book are therefore not differences of degree or emphasis, but differences of direction. The analytic tradition establishes with great precision what the subject of experience is not, while the present book provides what the analytic tradition consistently fails to reach, a positive ontological account of what the subject of experience is. The first and most fundamental difference is between problem formulation and problem resolution. The analytic tradition has produced extraordinary philosophical arguments for the irreducibility of phenomenal consciousness to physical or functional descriptions. Nagel's subjective character argument, Jackson's knowledge argument, Levine's explanatory gap, and Chalmers' hard problem are all arguments that establish what cannot be the case. The subject of experience cannot be captured by any third-person description. Phenomenal knowledge cannot be reduced to physical knowledge. The explanatory gap cannot be bridged by any causal or functional account. And the hard problem cannot be solved by any method that treats consciousness as a functional phenomenon. These are powerful negative results of the highest philosophical precision. But the analytic tradition, having established these negative results with such rigor, has largely failed to provide the positive ontological account that would resolve the problems it has so precisely formulated. Chalmers himself has proposed various approaches to the hard problem, including property dualism and panpsychism, but none has achieved consensus within the field, and all face significant philosophical objections. The analytic tradition knows with great precision what the answer is not. The present book proposes what the answer is. The second difference concerns the framework within which the problem is addressed. The analytic tradition addresses the hard problem of consciousness within a framework that assumes the ontological primacy of the physical world. Even when analytic philosophers of mind challenge materialism, as Chalmers does with his property dualism, and as Nagel does with his critique of neo-Darwinian reductionism, they typically remain within a framework that treats the physical world as ontologically given and consciousness as something that must be accommodated within or alongside that physical framework. The present book reverses this ontological priority entirely. It does not attempt to accommodate consciousness within a framework that treats matter as primary. It establishes through the evidence of contemporary physics, information theory, and quantum mechanics that matter is not ontologically primary, that the quantum vacuum is not inert emptiness, but the most fundamental ground of all physical reality, that everything that appears material is almost entirely empty space, and that every apparent level of material reality is a surface encoding of a deeper informational structure that is ultimately grounded in consciousness rather than in any independent material substrate. Within this inverted ontological framework, the hard problem of consciousness does not merely become easier. It dissolves entirely. The hard problem asks how consciousness arises from matter. The present book demonstrates that this question is malformed because its premise is false. Matter does not precede consciousness, but arises within it. Consciousness is not a product of the physical world, but the ground within which the physical world arises as a surface expression of the infinite creative activity of infinite consciousness. The third difference concerns the scope of the positive account provided. The analytic tradition, even when it moves beyond the purely negative results of the hard problem arguments toward positive proposals about the nature of consciousness, has not provided a complete architectural account of the subject of experience. Chalmers' property dualism identifies consciousness as a fundamental feature of reality alongside physical properties, but does not explain the internal structure of the subject of experience, the mechanism through which the infinite ground of consciousness localizes itself within individual human persons, or the precise relationship between the individual subject and the ultimate ground of all consciousness. Nagel's subjective character argument establishes the irreducibility of the first-person perspective, but does not explain what that perspective is, where it comes from, or what grounds it in a reality beyond individual human consciousness. The present book provides all of this through the four-self architecture of Wadat al-Kyle, the outer self, inner self, ideal self, and real self as four layers of localization within infinite consciousness, each with its own nature, its own bodily connection, its own form of intelligence, and its own domain of psychosocial health and illness. This architecture is the specific original contribution of the present book, and cannot be derived from or reduced to any proposal within the analytic tradition. The fourth difference concerns the relationship between the subject of experience and what Chalmers called the easy problems of consciousness. The analytic tradition distinguishes sharply between the hard problem and the easy problems, treating the former as philosophically intractable and the latter as genuinely tractable by scientific methods. The present book does not accept this sharp distinction. The easy problems, explaining how the brain processes information, regulates attention, integrates sensory data, and generates behavioral outputs, are indeed tractable by neuroscientific methods. But within the four-self architecture of the present book, these easy problems are not problems about consciousness at all. They are problems about the outer self's processing through the neural substrate of the brain. They concern the most surface-level encoding of the self's architecture rather than the self itself. What Chalmers calls the easy problems are in the present book's framework the entirely tractable questions about how one layer of oneself, the outer self operating through the brain, performs its specific cognitive and behavioral functions. The hard problem is hard not because consciousness is mysteriously added to an otherwise physical system, but because the question it asks, how does matter give rise to consciousness, is based on the false premise that matter is ontologically prior to consciousness. Remove the false premise, and the hard problem dissolves, leaving only the genuinely tractable questions about the specific mechanisms through which infinite consciousness localizes itself within individual human persons across the four layers of the self's architecture. The fifth difference concerns practical and clinical applicability. The analytic tradition's engagement with the hard problem has remained almost entirely within the domain of theoretical philosophy and has generated very few direct implications for psychology, psychotherapy, or clinical practice. The hard problem is recognized as one of the deepest philosophical puzzles of our time, but its resolution or dissolution has not been connected to any account of psychological health, psychological disorder, or therapeutic intervention. The present book connects the resolution of the hard problem directly to a complete clinical psychology of the self, demonstrating that the dissolution of the false premise underlying the hard problem, the recognition that consciousness is the ground of reality rather than its product, has immediate and precise implications for how we understand psychological health, what we identify as the sources of psychological disorder, and what we propose as the appropriate therapeutic interventions at each level of the self's architecture. This clinical applicability is entirely absent from the analytic tradition's engagement with the hard problem and represents a distinctive contribution of the present book that goes beyond what any purely theoretical philosophical analysis, however rigorous and precise, can achieve. These five differences do not diminish the profound debt that the present book owes to the analytic tradition. The arguments of Nagel, Jackson, Levine, and Chalmers have established with permanent philosophical force that the subject of experience is irreducible to any physical or functional description, that phenomenal knowledge cannot be reduced to physical knowledge, and that the explanatory gap between physical descriptions and phenomenal reality is a structural rather than a contingent feature of the problem. These results stand as landmarks of philosophical precision that no serious account of consciousness can ignore. The present book builds directly on these results, using them as the most rigorous available articulation of why the existing materialist framework is inadequate and why a fundamentally different ontological framework is required. But the present book goes beyond these results in precisely the direction that the analytic tradition has been unable to follow. From the precise formulation of the problem to the positive ontological account of its resolution, from the precise identification of what the subject of experience is not to the architecturally precise account of what it is, and from the purely theoretical philosophical analysis to the clinically applicable framework for understanding and addressing the full range of human psychological health and illness in light of the ontological account the present book provides. 4.14 What philosophy establishes and what it cannot reach. The philosophical traditions examined in this section have collectively produced two distinct and equally significant findings, one negative and one positive, whose combination defines with extraordinary precision both the nature of the problem of the subject of experience and the direction in which its resolution must be sought. The negative finding belongs primarily to the Western philosophical tradition from Descartes through the contemporary analytic school. The Western tradition has demonstrated with increasing logical precision and philosophical rigor that the subject of experience cannot be found by any method that treats the subject as an object of investigation. Descartes correctly identified the indubitability of the thinking subject, but then erred in attempting to locate it as a physical thing at a specific anatomical address. Hume applied the most honest introspective scrutiny available and found only a bundle of perceptions with no subject behind them, dissolving the subject without explaining the unity that requires a subject to account for it. Kant recognized that the subject cannot be found among the objects of experience and posited it as the formal condition of experience rather than one of its contents, but left it as a precisely drawn empty box without ontological content. Husserl refined this Kantian insight through the method of phenomenological reduction, but encountered the same structural difficulty. The subject is always already performing the reduction and therefore cannot appear as one of its objects. Merleau-Ponty grounded the subject in the lived body, but left open the question of what the subject is beyond its bodily situatedness. Sartre identified the structural reason for the subject's unlocatability, that it is always already doing the looking, without asking what grounds that consciousness in a reality beyond itself. Nagel demonstrated the irreducible first-person character of experience without identifying the subject that has that character. Levine formalized the explanatory gap that no physical description can bridge. Chalmers crystallized all of these insights into the hard problem and demonstrated that a philosophical zombie is conceivable without contradiction, establishing that the subject of experience is not entailed by any physical or functional description. What unites all of these Western philosophical contributions is a single structural feature that none of them overcomes. Philosophy, like neuroscience, operates by making things into objects of investigation. Concepts, arguments, introspective reports, phenomenological descriptions, and logical analyses are all objects of philosophical examination. But the subject of experience is never an object. It is the one doing the examining. Every philosophical method that attempts to find the subject uses the subject to conduct the search, and therefore leaves the subject itself perpetually one step beyond the reach of the method. This is not a criticism of Western philosophy. It is a clarification of its proper scope and a recognition of a structural feature of the subject-object relationship that no refinement of philosophical method can overcome. The subject cannot be found among the objects of experience, not because the methods are inadequate, but because the subject is categorically different from any object and therefore categorically beyond the reach of any method that examines objects. The positive finding belongs primarily to the non-Western and mystical philosophical traditions examined in the preceding subsections, and it constitutes a genuinely different kind of philosophical achievement from the negative results of the Western tradition. Ibn Sina's floating man argument establishes through philosophical thought experiment that the subject of experience is a non-spatial, non-material reality that persists in the complete absence of all bodily and sensory reference, going beyond Descartes' cogito in specifically separating the subject from the body rather than merely from doubt. Shankara's analysis of the witness consciousness and his neti-neti method of exhaustive negation identify the subject as the self-luminous ground of all awareness, present as the very light by which all introspective examination is conducted, arriving at a positive characterization of the subject that Western philosophy consistently reaches toward but never achieves. Nagarjuna's exhaustive elimination of every possible relationship between the self and the aggregates demonstrates that the subject has no inherent existence as a locatable component within any analytical framework, a conclusion that converges with the Western philosophical failures while providing a more precise structural account of why the failure is necessary. Zhuangzi's true ruler and butterfly dream address the subject's unlocatability through the route of poetic philosophical inquiry, arriving at the recognition that the subject is always already doing the governing and cannot be found among the things it governs. The Sufi tradition's account of fana establishes through direct experiential inquiry that the apparent independence of the individual subject is revealed in the deepest states of contemplative inquiry as a localization of the divine ground rather than a separate entity alongside it. Meister Eckhart's grunt identifies the ground of the soul as the point of the human person's deepest identity with the divine ground, a positive characterization of the subject's ultimate nature that is structurally identical to the real self in the four-self architecture of the present book. The Kabbalistic traditions Ein Sof and Tzimtzum provide a precise metaphysical account of both the ultimate subject as infinite ground and the mechanism through which individual localized subjects arise within that ground, converging with remarkable precision on the positive account of localization that the present book develops through the Wadat al-Kayal framework. The combination of these negative and positive findings defines with extraordinary precision both the nature of the problem and the direction of its resolution. The negative findings of the Western tradition establish that the subject cannot be located within any physical, psychological, or conceptual system by any method that examines systems from the outside or from among their own contents. The positive findings of the non-Western and mystical traditions establish that the subject's ultimate ground is an infinite awareness within which all individual subjects exist as localizations of its creative activity, and that this ground can be approached through routes of inquiry that go beyond the object-examining methods of Western philosophy, specifically through the direct experiential inquiry of contemplative practice, the philosophical analysis of witness consciousness, and the metaphysical analysis of the relationship between the infinite ground and its finite expressions. What neither the Western nor the non-Western philosophical traditions have provided, and what the present book is specifically designed to provide, is a convergence of these negative and positive findings within a single framework that establishes the positive conclusion through the logical and empirical methods of Western philosophy, rather than through the contemplative or theological roots of the non-Western traditions. The present book does not merely assert the convergence of diverse philosophical traditions around a common structural finding. It demonstrates through the method of exhaustive elimination combined with convergent necessity that the positive account of the subject developed through these non-Western traditions is not merely one coherent option among many, but the only adequate answer to the question that remains after every alternative has been eliminated. The routes of inquiry are different. The methods are different. The epistemic standards are different, but the structural conclusion is the same. The subject of experience is not a locatable entity within any physical, psychological, or conceptual system. It is the infinite ground of awareness within which all such systems arise as localizations of its creative activity. And the discovery of selfhood that the present book proposes through the four-self architecture of Wadat al-Kayal, grounded in logical argument and empirical evidence, is the first systematic attempt to establish this conclusion through methods that are in principle accessible to any serious intellectual inquirer regardless of their religious background, cultural tradition, or contemplative experience. The philosophical traditions examined in this section, therefore, do not collectively fail. They collectively establish the two most important findings available to any inquiry into the subject of experience: the precise structural reason why the subject cannot be found by any method that examines objects, and the positive ontological direction in which the subject's ultimate nature must be sought. The present book builds on both findings simultaneously, using the negative results of the Western tradition to eliminate every inadequate account, and the positive results of the non-Western and mystical traditions to orient the positive account that the elimination points toward. Together they make the present book's argument not merely compelling, but logically necessary. The only account of the subject of experience that survives the exhaustive elimination of every alternative and is confirmed by the convergence of every independent line of inquiry, philosophical, scientific, mystical, and experiential, is the account that the present book develops through the Wadat al-Kayal framework. The sole and only subject of all experience is infinite consciousness itself, the infinite ground within which every person, every self, every dominant self-configuration, and every moment of apparent individual experience arises, operates, and is sustained as a thought of the infinite mind. The dominant self is not the subject of experience. It is the active configuration of the person's psychological architecture through which infinite consciousness, the sole subject, channels its experiencing within a particular localized perspective at any given moment. There are no individual subjects within infinite consciousness. There is only infinite consciousness experiencing through an inexhaustible multiplicity of localized perspectives simultaneously, each perspective contributing an irreplaceable vantage point to the infinite whole's self-knowledge, none of them possessing subjecthood in their own right, all of them being expressions, instruments, and temporary configurations of the one awareness that has always been, and can only ever be the subject of everything that has ever been experienced anywhere in the universe.